Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go.
Today, I'm excited to have Michael Dominguez, the CEO of Associated Luxury Hotels International. But one thing when I was checking your bio, looking at everything, is like you used to work at one of my favorite properties, the Lowe's Ventana Canyon.
Yeah, actually, that was my start with Lowe's, and what a very magical place as far as location and what that looks like.
I wanted to talk to you about food and beverage costs and event budgets. I have, over the years, when you give your presentations, which are filled with such good data about the importance and the value of meetings, mean business, but also the costs. And you do a really good job of educating planners on that behind the scenes costs that hotels incur. And, you know, and part of that is the food and beverage. And you've thrown statistics out there on a variety of different things. But with COVID, it's really, different. A couple of months ago, we saw farmers throwing milk away and retilling their plants, their potatoes into the ground. I want to get your take on how this is going to impact meeting budgets and just our food and beverage in general.
Well, it's interesting because what we're finding right now on the food and beverage side, you've heard me say before, Tracy, the correlation is what you're experiencing in your normal life, we're experiencing operating a facility. And to me, that's the disconnect. So when you see an increase in pork, for instance, it's just understanding that, again, when things got more expensive in your own livelihood or in your own life, it's going to be the same impact moving into a facility. And the one thing I think that's important is that it's not universal. Okay. What I mean by that, it's not universal across all foods. What I've always tried to educate people on is pay attention to what's going on. And most importantly, talk to your chefs, because your chefs will tell you where there are opportunities versus where there are cost increases that have been put on top of them that are long-term. And the other part to that is, as long as it's not long-term, it's okay. There's an ebb and flow and it kind of balances out. But when you have long-term costs, when we had a pork spike for a year, that's something that's going to be substantial. And but at the same time, I can tell you, seafood and shrimp were coming down dramatically.
I saw that. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you're looking at it, it doesn't mean that you have to completely worry that your budget's going to go through the roof. It's talking to the people at the property saying, what's in season? Sometimes it's seasonal. What's in season, what's affordable, and what should we be doing? The things we're doing right now, what scares me, and I'm so frustrated that, there is news around the world we don't hear about because everything's been so politicized in this environment. Right. My big concern is China having to flood their own farmlands because the dams are at capacity and they have to release the water, and it's going to create a major food shortage in China. Nobody's talking about that. And I had to dig deep to read the report on it that's going into global papers and finding out that this is a major issue. Now, doesn't it make sense that we know there's friction between the United States and China, and yet China is still not only buying soy from us at a margin they never have before, but they're continuing to say they're going to move forward with the trade deal that was negotiated. Why do we think that is? Because they need the food. And it was a big agricultural purchase, if you remember. And what's happening in China, that's going to literally lift U.S. agriculture, which is good. But it may also lift pricing in certain areas that we weren't expecting. I don't know that runway yet, Tracy. I don't know which food, which products. But I think 90 days from now, it's something we're going to be talking about once we know what the impact is in China.
Well, and I heard at the beginning of we really don't pay attention to the imports and exports of the food that we get.
Yeah.
And we really focus on local, or we have been focusing on local, but we just assume that hotel property or that convention center is buying the best price and giving us the best price. But at the beginning of the pandemic, I saw that some of the Asian countries were going to limit how much rice was being shipped out. They were only going to take their current orders and their current customers. No new customers were going to be allowed to place orders. And that could potentially impact us as well.
Exactly. And that's what we're finding, that where's the dust all going to settle? I will tell you, I think what's really interesting when you look across the board, all industries are doing pretty well, except for the hospitality industry. If you look at the economy, everybody else candidly is doing okay from an economic standpoint. It's us. And I say that because even restaurants, if you've looked at it, it's groceries and food and fast food, it's all picked up. So
Right.
you're not having that push. The biggest concern we had about probably 90 days ago was the meat packing plants.
Yes.
And coronavirus outbreak and what that was going to do. Thankfully, they were short-lived, the outbreak, and they weren't universal. Had they hit all the plants at one time, we could have had a shortage.
Right.
Because of that, you had some hiccups in the logistics chain, but things have started to move through. I just don't see that unless the concern is going to be, is there a bad outbreak sometime in the fall in the meat packing areas? But I know there's enough concentration to make sure that they were paying attention to COVID safety in those type of facilities that hopefully we don't have that issue.
And we, just as much as we are talking about keeping our employees safe, we want to pay attention to that, how they're keeping their employees safe, because that impacts us going across the board. And these small local farmers don't have the processing abilities or the number of cattle to feed the events that we're doing. Maybe our smaller events, but not, big, huge ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the positive. We don't have big, huge events going on.
True.
If there's any balance right now, because
Yes.
you bring up a good point. When it all comes to a head, we'll see it. But right now, we still have some supply hiccups. But at the same time, we don't have meetings of scale taking place.
Right.
And that's probably not going to take place anytime within the 6 months, as far as meetings of those sizes that we think about.
Right.
That's actually a positive for us. It gives us some ability to catch up in case of some of those issues. But you are correct. It's going to, at some point, line up and hit a peak. And at that point, we're going to be talking about what does that mean. California specifically, some of their outbreak has to do in farm country.
Yes.
And the Wall Street Journal did a great recap on this, explaining that their positivity rate is almost double there anywhere else in the state. And it's them trying to control the workers. And we keep saying communal settings. The people that are working on these farmlands or in the fields, they tend to live in apartment type buildings while they're working, and very communal, and that's big for spread. Those are my concerns, because if that continues and you have to stop production and you only have a window to be able to pull certain product, that's when you get into an opportunity that we could have some shortages. We haven't seen it yet because luckily it's kind of bouncing around. It's not all in one time, but if it ever hits at one time, and I think we have to at least understand that could happen.
Right.
But if it ever hits at one time, then we're in trouble.
The one thing, because you mentioned California, and I saw a couple posts last night, is about the fires that are hitting Napa, and it's so devastating for a couple of resorts have burned down, and the wineries, thankfully, some of them that I read in an Eater article, is that the fields are safe in some and the buildings are safe in others. And hopefully that doesn't impact too much with that. But that's another thing that we need to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, without a doubt. And, sadly to say, one of our properties was the image you saw. Meadowwoods is an ALHI property. And it was the image we all saw that's just so devastating. And, but you're right, it's hitting it in pockets. And, it's funny. It's just 2 years ago Napa was hit with major fires. But you're right. It's in some areas the vineyards are fine, and but we always talk about what's the wine going to be like coming out of it, because soil content and what's in the air and what that looks like. But Napa, Napa's gritty. They will come back. I think there is one positive is if there's any shortfall in Napa, we have so many wine producers around the states that have grown. I mean, the areas have grown tremendously that could help offset some of that. There just may be some larger takes in a given year.
And I do remember reading an article like last month about how France is actually giving money to their wine manufacturers to make sure that they don't lose their businesses.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a biggie, and a lot of our wineries were small businesses, and they were able to get help by some of the legislation as well. And it's one of those years. I mean, seriously, you've got everything you've been dealing with. They're starting to get some momentum. They're starting to feel like come back, and then this hits, and it seems like that has been the year we're living with.
Oh, completely. Okay, so on a different topic of food and beverage, but it's labor. And you and I asked you a question last week when you were talking to MPI Philadelphia, and about that. And I've chatted with a couple of properties since then, not necessarily ALHI properties, but like one yesterday, she's like, it's the general manager, I'm the director of sales, and we're serving the food, and we're actually outsourced the food and beverage to a catering company because we've let our entire culinary team go. So across your ALHI properties and just everybody else, how are you seeing that, and what expectations should we have?
Well, it's twofold. I was just in a conversation yesterday, and it was more of a real estate conversation about people developing hotels and such. But the conversation that we were talking about, and I think this is important, you have to separate the resorts from the city hotels.
Okay.
And the reason for that is your resorts, the leisure business has been through the roof. They've never depended on business travel, but they do depend on group business. So they need some of that group business to come back, and they're starting to see it. The city hotels depend on business travel. They depend on citywide conventions that aren't going to be in these major cities anytime soon. Going back to what we just said, those large ones aren't coming back right away. They're the ones that are even struggling more. And what you're hearing seems to be very similar. I mean, we just had a program at Sea Island last weekend with 39 customers, and it was a leadership summit that we do annually. And the interesting thing is they're there, and their food and beverage was there, and the staff was there. What they do find, and this is consistent in all of our hotels, is that they're so busy on the weekends that midweek you can't bring everybody back, because 4 days a week you don't have the business, and then you have business 3 days a week. So you do have people that, okay, I might be a sales executive and I am helping with pool duty on a weekend. That tends to be a little more of the challenge. And what we are finding, and this is what I would look at when you say what to expect, I think in our resort, the resort community, the culinary team's there. So that's not your hiccup. But because of how we're servicing now, we may need more people in stations because you're going to do a buffet style. And I'm going to need more people helping. Some of those people helping may not be typical culinary staff because they're just helping serve. But that's all within the hotel. I've now experienced, we've done 3 meetings. I've been visiting our properties since June. And what you're finding is a lot of normalcy. You won't feel it or see it from the client side. There may be a circus behind the curtains going on because people are doing things that they don't always do, but you're not going to feel it. Surprisingly, the experience has been pretty consistent across the board. It's the new protocols with us getting used to it, but outside of that, it's been pretty consistent.
Well, and meeting planners are used to being, doing circles behind the scenes from their customers. So if we can help ease that. And it was what I really did like too, is this one small property. She's like, all of us, the general manager and everybody has gotten their Serve Safe certifications for food handling. So I love that. So and then I was talking to a property today in Orlando, and they are, like you said, doing different roles in different positions. And I think it actually makes us stronger.
I agree.
Property stronger because they're learning different aspects of the property that they didn't necessarily they took for granted or didn't know about, and now they see how it all works together.
Yeah, I don't disagree. And, one of the things that I thought was really telling, we had Chef Thomas with us he runs the Fontainebleau, and he's an executive chef, but he's also the senior vice president of operations, so he runs all of that. But it's interesting what he talked about, because we've had him on our client calls that we do weekly, and he was walking through the kitchen and explaining what he just said. He didn't have to change much in their safety from a food and beverage standpoint, because they've always served that way. They've always cooked that way. They've had to look at the same things we all do, is distancing with their team members. Mm-hmm. What does that do? And one of the things that he taught us, I think, is important. People keep telling me, well, it's just going to add cost. There's also costs coming away. There's costs being added, and then there's costs being removed. And, what he explained to us, for instance, their banquet menu for a dinner, they may have used to have 50 options. They may have shrunk that down to 15 to 20. And in their standard restaurants, what they're doing, and anybody who's eaten out recently, some of the menus have shrunk down. Well, one of the reasons you're shrinking the menus is because I have to keep that same distancing in the kitchen. I'm losing team members because I can't have the same bodies that I used to in the same square footage, specifically in a small kitchen. So when you think about that, that means in certain shifts, I'm losing labor, even though I may be picking up labor on the front side of it on how I serve. It's really complex. And the one thing I would recommend to everybody is don't assume and don't overthink it, because we all know enough about the mechanics to be dangerous versus those that have to do it every day. So there is a balance of it. And yeah, there's extra labor, there's extra cost. The one thing I've shared with everybody, if this goes on, if these are the protocols for a year and a half, you're going to have costs that are going to move over to a planner. In the short term, what we have heard from all of our hotels, this is what we have to do business right now. So this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
So that's where I think planners, because the first thing I keep hearing is, we're going to get hit with all these costs. Well, no, but if we have a sit-down option for you and you want a buffet option, and now I have more stations with more labor, you may get some more labor charges for those extra stations you want because you're choosing to do that versus a sit-down meal. But that's not really much different than in the past if you're going to have action stations.
Okay, and just got Carolyn Benjamin. I was looking at the wrong thing. A buffet is being served by staff rather than allowing guests to help themselves. Buffets in UK for all services have been replaced by plated, especially at breakfast.
Actually, they are being served. And even at Sea Island, the program we just had right now was just brilliantly done.
Yeah.
Literally, if you could imagine, the station, we were outdoors for a dinner. They had the grills going. They had all of the cooks there. And what was interesting, it was almost shaped like a U. So the first section we went to, people behind it were serving us. And we continued to push that around. But as I got through that station, you turned, and now you're on the other side of the U. They've passed the plate to the next station. You're not touching the plate at all. And you're picking what you want. And then we got to the next station, and then we grabbed it again. And at the end of it, I got my plate. But it felt good. There was a lot of engagement and interaction. And it's everything you've always done without you touching your plate until it's all finished, when it's all done. And yeah, I see the note. I heard buffeteria style. It feels like that, but it was also very elegant. I want to say that because sometimes we think cafeteria. Didn't feel like a cafeteria. It was very, very well done and very high end.
That's great. And because that's what we don't want it to be, a cattle call. And I don't know if I did this the other day, and I don't know how much you can see it, but I'm like, let's make plexiglass fun, right? And write the menus on here. Or, here's a sticker, use a logo, client logo, and stick it on there. So this is sponsored by ALHI or NC State Wolfpack.
Go Wolfpack.
Go Wolfpack. But, and I think that you can do it, and the action stations can still be done with some fun behind the curtains kind of thing too.
Well, and the one thing I will express is that we've now done 3 meetings in this environment, largest being 120 people, smallest being this one was 60. And we didn't lose engagement. We didn't lose energy. It didn't feel different. It just it looks a little different
Right.
because you're not used to the plexiglass and you're not used to everybody wearing their mask. Outside of that, it wasn't different. And I think that's an important note for people. You can still engage and you can still make food and beverage part of that engagement. Tracy, one of the things we did that it was in this whole staying put is what we were trying to do. The one question that keeps coming up, everybody's like, how do you do a networking reception? And I kept saying, you don't. You just said you don't, because you can't keep separation. Masks are removed. It's just not a good environment. We actually solved for that on our last meeting. So what we ended up doing is we actually took 4 different rooms. We had rounds with 4 people, just as we would with dinner. We've sat down. They were pre-assigned. We knew, and when you checked in on our badge, it told us which room you were being assigned to.
Okay.
So then you went to that room, and what was really interesting was we end up going to that room. You sit down, and in front of each of us was a small rectangular plate with four different appetizers that would have normally been butler pass.
Right.
But they're already sitting in front of us for each one of us to get in front of us to be able to eat. And what you do realize is alcohol is a really great motivator. You won't get served until you're seated.
Oh.
So we will bring you your drinks for the networking reception once you sit down. And once you're seated, everybody is seated, we will start serving. Funny thing is we've done this now, and we did it over a couple of nights. It works. And it worked well. And it was engaged. And then what we ended up doing is the 4 people that were with us at that table, together we were released by room. And now I had 4 people that are 3 other people that I knew as I'm walking to the dinner. And now I'm at another assigned seat with 4. But by the time I got through dinner, I mean, there were 6 other people at my table, which isn't that far off of you being at a round of 10 for any kind of event over a period of time frame.
And so, and you put 6 people at a 72-inch round?
4.
Okay. All right.
4. If you're doing it completely, the triangle is 3 per 72, 72, 72. You've got your 6 feet. When you do 4, you're just squeaking inside of 6 feet, but almost 6 feet all the way around in the circumference. Yeah. Most people don't sit right at the table. So if you're sitting back from the table, you are literally at 6 feet. You just have to keep, you would actually have to round measure to get there, but you do. I mean, it's a little bit of geometry getting into it, but that is more than comfortable and more than effective in what we've been doing.
Well, and I did some diagrams myself, and my mom was watching me do it. She's like, how are you figuring that out? I'm like, doing the geometry of it.
It really is. I mean, it really was taking me back to geometry.
Yes. So one of the things that I emailed you was reconcepting the traditional food and beverage. And you kind of have talked about that a little bit. I mean, I think it's definitely something different that we have to utilize. And as we go into winter, we're not going to be able to use outdoor spaces, up north and things like that. So if you were a space hog before, you're going to be even more of a space hog now for your programs. How are your properties? How do you think that we can balance that out? Because I think everybody has to be patient and understanding on both sides.
I agree. We keep saying it requires a lot of grace right now from everybody. And the one thing I've told planners, and I think this is the best way to describe it, Tracy, is that you've always given me a cube and you've told me, okay, here's my meeting, make it fit.
Right.
And I go, you're still giving me a cube, but we all need to understand it's now a Rubik's Cube. And I'm going to have to keep moving the sides until they all line up. And there's some simple things. I've seen some different events. And I think the biggest change that people have to think about in the short term while we're in this environment is you've got to rethink your general session. The biggest eat up of space that you use for about an hour and a half is a general session.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've seen groups do, a couple of different options, which I think are great, is one, I've seen groups where they've actually brought everybody and moved them straight into breakouts, and now they broadcast the general session into the breakouts. You get your largest space back, by the way, which makes it really convenient to continue to be able to move and be able to fit with this distancing that you would need.
Right.
I've also seen the suggestion, for instance, where people have been told to stay in their room. They had a breakfast goodie bag that was delivered in the mornings, and the general session was broadcast through the open channels that all TVs have. You're not having movement. You don't have to worry about your largest group of people coming together at one time. They finish that and they move to breakouts. Again, it's rethinking what you've always done. And then one of the bigger shifts we've done as well is, okay, if you're in those breakouts, we just did this when we did our Back to Business Experiential Forum. We had everybody stay in the breakouts. We moved the speakers. So once you had people sitting down, I'm now moving in a 120 person meeting. I was moving 6 people in between breakouts instead of moving 100 and 114.
Right.
That is just a shift in our old thinking.
Yep.
You always have everybody else meet. No, I put the pressure on the speaker. Speakers are going to have to move, and they're going to have to move and set up and do that. And again, a little bit of grace. Need a little bit more time in between. Need to make sure that everybody understands I may be testing audio and such right as we get going. So it was a little bit different in that regard. But the other piece to that is when we did the general session, we actually kept everybody, because everybody had 6 feet of separation. They had their own space. They were assigned seating, so nobody else has been there. We actually served lunch in there. So when we had everybody take a break, we challenged, and we worked on that one with the Omni. We challenged the Omni to say, help us do this. They created a very cool lunch that all came on a board, looked like a large sandwich board. But of course, it was sandwiches and salads. And their salad, again, trying to avoid touch, trying to avoid mess because of how we're situated in this room. They had these mason jars that had a Caesar salad in them. It was already in there with the salad and the croutons and the dressing. People shook it up. They turned it over, and they had a little bamboo plate that it had been served on that you're tipping it over, and the salad's now in the plate. You're done. But it was easy to serve.
And the bamboo is recyclable, and the mason jars are washable.
Exactly. So sustainability was really big in play. And when you talk about grace, and I know you've talked about this often, when we talk about sustainability, and it is important to hotels today, I don't know any hotel that's just ignoring sustainability. The one thing we've said is what you said it a minute ago, we need a little bit of grace. And I've had planners hit us on this as we've started to move. Is like, what about the sustainability? There's only so much product available. And in certain areas, when we're having to now package everything, it may not be available. It doesn't mean we're not trying to get it. Right. It just means we're going to need a little time for the producers to be able to produce it. Yep. And when they get there, we will start getting it. But as much as possible, we're trying. And, if you remember when we went from plastic straws to paper straws, there was only one producer in the U.S. We couldn't get enough of them when it first started. Yeah. Fast forward a year, and we have paper straws almost everywhere. It's not that hard, but we needed some grace in between so that you can actually get the product. And I can't stress that enough. I just plead with people to know it's not that we're not intentionally looking at sustainability. We have a health pandemic that we're dealing with, and we're trying to balance all of it. And in some cases, we just can't get it. That's going to be an issue.
Well, and one of the things too with that bamboo plate, and then thinking about that property that doesn't have their culinary team, to use regular china, they don't have anybody to clean it except for the sales team and the general manager. So using the sustainable dishware and things like that is going to be the best option for them. But whereas another big property, they're full throttle doing big events in their property, and they can use their china and they have their stuff because they were able to keep their full-time servers and culinary team, not their part-timers are not the ones coming back.
Yeah. And, and I even think about it. I was able to do I always say the underbelly of the Fountain Blue as they were walking me through the
You got in the back of the house?
Sorry?
You got in the back of the house during the pandemic?
It was so cool. But it was showing me their protocols, which was amazing. And that's why I was there. So they're walking me through, they're showing me how they're testing employees. They're showing me what they're doing. But when I got to the employee dining room and, in those type of properties, you're feeding 1,000 people a day minimum. What's really interesting is they've even taken the time. They don't have, even though you don't want the touch, they didn't go with paper cups because of the waste. It's not that it can use a recyclable cup, but you're still creating a great deal of waste. Right. But what they had, and they do this every day, they bag. And in every bag for the employees, they've got a cup and they have their silverware and their napkins so that they can go through the line, get their meal, and then they will be washing those cups and washing everything and getting it back in play. They were really worried about the garbage they would be creating with everybody going to paper cups or something along those lines. Still recyclable, but a lot of product that you're going to go through that you didn't have to go through every day. So it's this balance. But I say that because I think you said it, earlier when we were talking about people producing food. What's happening to the customer experience, we're having to think about in the team experience as well, because first and foremost, we're protecting our team members, at those properties. So it's understanding we're having to do this on both sides as far as how we think through this. It's complicated.
That it is very complicated. So Caroline posted a question. It's a little lengthy, but it's about allergies, which, dietary needs, which, I'm very adamant about. And Caroline does the same thing I do, but in the UK.
Got it.
How have you seen, and the chefs that I've been talking about, they're like, it is just as important that we get this right when we're doing these small meetings, because allergies and dietary restrictions are part of food safety. So did the Fontainebleau and the Omni, how did they handle your guests with dietary restrictions? Actually,
it's really been easier because the groups are a little bit smaller right now.
Mm-hmm.
More complicated when they're larger.
Right.
When it's smaller right now, it's been easier. And it's no different than in the past in that we're getting the communication up in front.
Okay.
If I have the communication early, it's easy. And it's making sure on our registration on these meetings, we've let everybody know, here are the questions. What are your dietary? And not only do you have dietary restrictions, what are they?
Right.
And we've grown tremendously because you and I remember the day where the dietary restriction was that you were vegetarian. Yes. And we've moved well past that. And I know, my wife avoids gluten because of her MS and, very sensitive to that. And I've had to learn a lot going out to eat. But we've also learned, what's funny is 5 years ago, that was really complicated. It's not that complicated today. It's hard for us to go to a restaurant that they can't hit most of your allergies.
Okay. Well, I'm not taking you to the restaurant that I went to last night.
Yeah, good.
I wanted to cry. And my mom and my niece were like, Tracy, and I'm like, I got the blandest piece of chicken and cold broccoli. And in this day and age, I'm like, really, how can you do that? Okay, so and you have 50, they haven't cut their menu, and I've had good meals there before, but it was just very disappointing. One more question that I wanted to ask, where was it? Okay, so I've seen it twice now that 2 properties are saying we don't have the culinary teams, so you can bring in your outside caterers. And I know that hotels have done that in the past when they, you have to do kosher or halal or Indian. But it's probably going to be smaller properties maybe doing this, but the loopholes around that, because it used to be adamant, no outside food and beverage. So I think they're being flexible now with that. Is there any things that we need to be thinking about when we're talking to our partners on that?
Yeah. What's interesting is, again, I haven't seen the full service hotels go there at all. Okay. And I don't think that's going to be a trend you're going to see. It is really pocketed as far as what it looks like across the country. And the reason I say that, Tracy, in our discussions, you're trying to create as much of an employee bubble as possible. Mm-hmm. Letting an outside contractor in, all you have to do in this environment is have anything spread within your staff, and you've now got a bigger problem because you don't have all your staff back. Anybody that's starting to test positive, if you have any kind of outbreak, you're now losing staff members for 2 weeks. Right. So that's a challenge because in our environments, what we're doing every day is monitoring our employees, testing our employees, knowing what they're going through. One of the things we've been talking about in the hotel world is how do we treat outside vendors in all categories? The people delivering your food, what are your protocols for that? It becomes even more problematic when you're bringing in an outside catering company that's now in your kitchen and around any staff members and what that looks like. There's a lot that has to be thought through to make it happen. And I could see some of the smaller properties, that's a better avenue for them. Right. Any of the full service resorts, though, I haven't seen that be the norm at all. That's not the limitation with staff. Okay. The limitation with staff that we're finding more than anything is, you've got a building that you can fill up from a guest room standpoint every weekend, and then middle of the week you don't, you can't bring all your housekeeping staff back,
Right.
because you don't have enough work for them through the rest of the week. That tends to be a bigger problem. What's been really good is, the restaurant teams. You may have restaurant teams working in banquets at
Right.
certain times as we start to have them. But that's not abnormal. We've done that in the hotel industry for some time.
Okay, so which triggered another question. So in your former hotels, MGM, all of those restaurants, were they staffed by MGM staff, or those were outside staffing?
In most cases, they're MGM staff.
Okay.
And there's very few that were licensed. Sometimes there's a license agreement, and in that case, somebody is paying you rent and they run it all. It's their employees. The majority, and MGM was unique that way because they wanted to own the food and beverage experience and what they could do. In most cases, those are MGM employees, even if there's another name on the building or something like that.
Okay. But that's a good question for a planner to ask about the restaurants that are in the box that they're running.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. And you've heard me say often, I mean, even from a negotiating standpoint, when people used to say, I'm buying out your restaurant, if it's a leased restaurant, you didn't bring anything to the table in the negotiation.
Exactly.
Because the lease is the same lease, regardless of you using it or not. You're not bringing extra money to the property itself, as far as that negotiation arm. So, yeah, it's always a good question to ask as far as what that looks like.
That's a really good point. All right, Lisa has one final question. Are we going to see increased costs for the individual packaging, like the box lunches and things like that, or is that just going to be built into the prices? I would say they were built into the prices, but
they've been built into it. And candidly, when you're doing that too, I said this earlier, you're kind of losing cost as well. You're not having as many pieces that go with it when you're serving food like this.
Right.
I've seen some very innovative ones. We did another program, and literally everything they had almost like your own bento box ready to go. Okay. And you kept adding to it, and you had, again, a bamboo tray, and you started with your bento box, but then they had little sandwiches that were in these little square containers. So you picked your sandwich you wanted. Again, it's not any different than me putting that sandwich in a bigger container. When it's all said and done, it seems like a lot more. It's really not, because the food becomes a little bit different as well. I may have, instead of having the sandwiches, for instance, you may have had a full sandwich board layout, or you may have a chef that was helping produce it. That kind of went away as you've got the boxed item. So there's a little bit of a trade-off when you're doing those type of things.
I like the reduced waste aspect of that as well, from buffet plated. Yeah.
It's been a big deal on the waste side of it as well. Yeah. I mean, in a big way. And even with them serving you everything on a buffet, your waste is down, because they have all the food and they're keeping it prepared. They're not letting it sit in a chafing dish over a long period of time. So they're able to make sure that they are going to utilize the food appropriately.
Awesome. Well, is there anything that you can think of around food and beverage that we also need to consider?
No, I think the biggest part of it, one of the things that kept coming out were coffee breaks.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
And when I first started talking about coffee breaks, it was so interesting, because we were explaining that your coffee is going to be served. And we had clients that their first thing was, well, this is really going to slow down the process. And I said, you could only pour one cup of coffee at a time to begin with out of the urns. If you think through this, I mean, we sometimes jump to this conclusion that it's going to dramatically change. It's actually sped it up. I've now experienced it. And if you think about it, if you've ever, running through, and you probably haven't, I know you haven't, but running through an airport, if you have to pick up fast food in McDonald's or something, when they're rushing, they're lining up, here are my Cokes, here are my Diet Cokes, here's my Sprite. And there's multiples, and they're just delivering orders. Here's your order. You ordered Coke, and they're grabbing one. That's no different than me. No, you're breaking at 10:30, and I'm now lining up. Here's coffee. Here's decaf, and here's hot water, and I'm going to serve it to you. And I have one person behind me refilling me as I'm giving out coffee or I'm giving out decaf. It didn't slow down the process at all. It does make you think about multiple stations.
Right.
You have to think about flow. And that is a part that I think the planner really has to be asking the questions is, do I have enough space? Do I have enough stations to space everybody out? Yeah. And then on the food and beverage side, it does matter when you're It's less to do with the food, but more to do in how you're serving it. I always think of a good old fashioned Irish Catholic mass. You have to remove people and excuse people in groups. If not, you're going to have everybody flooded together. So when we did those networking breaks that I told you about, we released each room in 5-minute increments.
Okay.
So the first room went out. They were already out at dinner. Then we came back 5 minutes later. We released the second room of 20 people. They went out. 5 minutes later, we came and released the next room. That actually mattered because then getting into our dinner setting, you had 20 people getting seated as the next 20 people are still up and now getting seated. If not, you're going to get this congestion of people. And I won't say it's more dangerous because you're wearing your mask and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, but it doesn't provide comfort. And you're also trying to get a psychology of comfort. You don't want anyone feeling crowded.
Right.
I think that is something to really think through and to be really innovative. Just because we're boxing it, I think the mentality is don't think of the old-fashioned box lunches.
Right.
The best way we can phrase it is that we're doing a boxed meal, but it's not the box was the vessel. That has nothing to do with the food that was inside of it. And I've had some really elegant meals in this setting that have been served, it seems like, in a boxed format, even though it's not. That would be my biggest thing, is not to get hung up on the old romantics and the way we used to look at it.
That's awesome. And it's being creative. I saw a salad delivered with a cone, a clear cone on top, and then it was revealed. And so you can have fun. And I think outside caterers are a little bit more creative, have been a little bit more creative in their food and beverage that way. But I think hotels can, do that as well.
Well, and my biggest wish is that as we go through this, and especially when we come out of it, is that we don't lose that innovation and creativity. Yeah. I mean, what food and beverage has always done was create the memory. And I think that is an amazing statement. That's the importance of F&B. Yeah. It is the memory. It's the experience. It's what you can't recreate. We're doing it really well because people are like, wow, that's really cool. And they're simple. And I do like the phrasing. It was one of our clients with Toyota, the way she said it. Simple right now that is innovative and brilliant in certain ways is really where we're at. And it doesn't have to be complex, but it just needs to be, to your point, kind of cool. Yeah. Something different that you haven't seen.
Exactly. And so hopefully this pandemic does help fuel creativity and across the board, and from food safety and everything in between. Well, I thank you for your time today. I know you're like all over, and I know you're home. Are you home for a few days?
I'm home this week. I was on the road for 7 straight days. So I just got back. I was in multiple hotels and multiple programs. And, I did post this, Tracy. It's the one thing I would let everybody know. My LinkedIn post exploded when I talked about, at that time, I had done 11 trips since June 8th, visiting our hotels, looking at protocols. I continue to get tested and I continue to be negative. And the point I'm making is, if you're ready to travel, you can do it safely if you follow protocol. We all have a shared interest in this and a shared responsibility. But I always say it's not that hard. Wear your mask, keep your distance, and wash your hands, and you'll be fine. Yes. The rest of it takes care of itself, because the hotels and the airlines, by the way, they're doing a really, really good job of making sure that they're creating safe environments. And that would be my only add.
Well, and your comment last week is, when the dance floor opens, go to your room.
Yeah, it's so true. Without a doubt.
Yes. Okay. Well, I appreciate the continued guidance and leadership that you have in this industry. So thank you very much. And I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Tracy. I know how passionate you are around food. Keep leading the good fight, because you do a great job of educating everybody about what's important.
Thank you, Michael. All right.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.